Good afternoon, and welcome to our program on Innovate Responsibly, AI regulation in Silicon Valley and Asia. We are thrilled to be partnering with Google for this event. Thank you to James Green, who's on our advisory council, and Nicole Azoros and his team. Our mission at Asia Society is to navigate shared futures, and that's become increasingly difficult these days. We do this through our events on policy and business, education, and arts and culture. We have 16 centers around the world, and our team handles the Pacific Northwest, in Northern California, and newly in Seattle. And what differentiates our centers is our focus on technology. I'm Margaret Conley, the executive director of our centers. Our team is with us here today, too. Welcome in the audience to consuls generals from Japan, Ukraine, and Singapore, and the representative from the Hong Kong Economic Trade Office. We look forward to hearing your viewpoints as well during this program, during the Q&A. We have 5 expert speakers on AI with us. I am going to introduce our moderator shortly. He'll introduce the speakers. All of our speaker bios are on our website in full. For our format today, Jake's going to lead that moderated discussion, and there'll be an opportunity for audience Q&A at the end. When it's time for audience Q&A, raise your hands, wait for Jake to call on you. A microphone will be brought to you. Please introduce yourselves. We have a lot of new faces to us in the room. We'd like to know who you are. This event is on the record. We're recording, and the video is going to be posted to our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We have an hour for this discussion, until 3:30 Pacific. Then we're going to have a half hour, thanks to Google, for drinks and food in the background with networking. Our speakers, some of them will stick around and chat with you too. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to our all-star lineup. A few words about Jake before I hand it over to him. Jacob Ward, he's an on-air correspondent, formerly with NBC News based in San Francisco, where he covers the intersection of tech, human behavior, and social change. Before that, he was editor-in-chief at Popular Science magazine and Al Jazeera's science and tech correspondent. You've seen him all over TikTok, written all over publications, and he's hosted on-air shows too. Please welcome Jake Ward.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Really appreciate that. And thank you for being here, everybody. There's a lot of you here, and you are all fascinating, but I think that the most fascinating audience members here today are there are many representatives here from various Asian and Southeast Asian economies. People here from the consulates, and I think it's sort of to them that we're going to be speaking today, with all due respect to the rest of you, because I think that this is a moment of being able to learn about how we are as a society, as humanity, right? Trying to sort out what AI is going to mean for us, what's it going to do to us, and what steps we should take either in advance or maybe not at all to put some guardrails around that. And so I think that is a really interesting thing. Before I get into that, let me run through who we have with us today. It's a very esteemed panel. So to my left here is Alice Hunt-Friend. She's head of AI and emerging tech policy here at Google. Ganapathy Krishnan, he goes by Krish, is vice president and science fellow at ServiceNow. Kathy Baxter is principal architect of responsible AI and tech at Salesforce. And last but not least, John Cabeca is U.S. Intellectual Property Counselor for South Asia. He covers Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And so there's really nothing around both AI and Asia that this panel can't handle. So I'm excited about that. So I'm going to start with, let's start, maybe first of all, Kathy, I'm going to start with you, because you were speaking earlier about the landscape as it is beginning to emerge right now. I imagine, right, an economy, an Indonesia, a Singapore, somebody, right, out there looking at the landscape in which AI is taking hold and the fledgling regulations that are just getting off the ground, and trying to think to themselves, okay, what model are we going to follow? What is the world that we're going to live in? And I'm wondering if you are seeing early examples, in your view, from Salesforce, of regulations that certain economies are trying or thinking about, or I'm wondering if you think there's a crystallization of the sort of philosophy of regulation taking hold at all across the world, or is it entirely different place to place?
Yes, it's amazing to see the huge differences in how each country or region is approaching this right now. So we have the EU with the EU AI Act that are identifying risk-based AI systems and models and coming up with regulations around that. The U.S., I think, is taking a more state-based approach, with California leading a lot of this, but many other states are also prioritizing regulations. In Asia, we're seeing quite a diversity. Singapore is, instead of creating a lot of regulation, is trying to create a lot of resources to make it as easy as possible for organizations to create AI responsibly. So they have the AI Verify toolkit that will enable individuals to use easy-to-use tools to identify bias and toxicity and other assessments of their models. They recently announced $1 billion Singaporean dollars investment in the region. So whether it's R&D, being able to help individuals that lose their jobs due to AI automation get retrained and find new jobs, which I think is amazing, and more countries, more governments need to do that. Also the development of their own regional language model, Sea Lion. So it's based on 11 local languages, dialects, accents. So it really does work for them and their region. And then turn to Indonesia, where they are taking a sector-based approach. And they identified financial services, or the fintech industry, to be the highest risk. So that's what they're focusing on first. A couple of years ago, when I was in Vietnam and speaking with the government there as they're thinking through the regulation, they were really thinking about external foreign companies bringing their AI in and potentially harming their citizens. And so trying to figure out how do they create regulations to open up and make the AI as transparent as possible, so that they can understand if it's being used in ways that are harmful.
Yeah.
So we're seeing just a huge variety of approaches that different countries are taking in how they want to regulate, or maybe not regulate the technology, but invest in other ways to help make it safer.
Right. John, when you look across, right, the landscape that you travel, right, if I think about you speaking to a representative of Bhutan or the Maldives or Pakistan, I'm wondering, for you, in your experience, do you have any hope that there can be a kind of universal human idea of what responsible technology like AI can look like, or is it always by nature going to be individualized from nation to nation?
So I think the countries that you mentioned are still figuring out their AI capacity and how it will be used and deployed and employed. I think going to India, though, that's been very focused on AI development, and then comparing it to the steps that we've taken in the U.S., where I'm sure you're all aware of the President Biden's executive order that basically challenged every part of our country, every part of our government to either look at ways to make sure that AI is being used in a safe and effective way that doesn't impact the prosperity and the security of our people. And then at the same time, we've seen examples around so we're still working that out, right? Through the executive order, we just released on the intellectual property side, just released guidance of how, our examiners will be looking at certain inventions related to inventorship of AI. That was just a few days ago. And then when we go to India, they're also seeing what's happening. They're very much focused on, they want to be a leader in AI. They're very focused on what's taking place globally. And at the same time, they're cautiously moving forward on what type of regulatory approach they'll take with respect to AI development and what that would look like. And I think from my perspective, we talk about safety and security of AI. That's one thing that we have to address. And then separately, And it might be different, as we've already seen from around the world. But when it comes to intellectual property, having divergence of policies and how to protect and obtain intellectual property and the extent to which AI's contribution would or would not be, eligible for protection, I think that's quite challenging as that differs. And where we're more aligned in that will help ensure that AI continues to develop and flourish globally. And then going back to where we have different regulatory bodies throughout the world, that regulatory divergence is something that our industries are going to have to navigate, and that's going to be very complicated as well, the more that they diverge.
So, Alice, let's get sort of Google's perspective on this, right? If we have, we're in here in the United States, where Google was created, we have a long tradition of trying to empower innovation and not bog it down in regulation as much as we can. At the same time, there is, I think right now, a very strong political wind when it comes to figuring out some sort of regulation, whether it's preemptive or reactive, I don't know, but there's some sense that something, it can't be as open as it has always been when it comes to AI. And I wonder just what Google's position is on this, what your experience has been speaking to policymakers about it, and what lesson you think you might be able to offer to the audience here today.
Yeah, thanks, Jake, and I'm really thrilled to be here and to have you here and all these panelists here on campus with us, and thanks to everyone for coming out in our just lovely weather today. I think that's the essential question, actually, that you just asked, and I think what we've seen in the last year, especially in the global AI conversation, is a lot of focus on risks and harms, which is an important conversation to have. And we certainly at Google have proceeded on the basis of our own AI principles, which have a lot to do with ensuring that AI is not developed or used in harmful or biased ways. That said, what we've also been seeing, and especially in Asia, in fact, we did a poll at the end of last year with Ipsos and polled global publics. And Asia was the region around the globe that had the most optimism about AI. And we think this is an essential thing to stress with policymakers, which is the benefits that we can unlock with AI are truly once in a generation. And so when we think about regulatory approaches to this new technology, we need to think about ways to preserve our ability to unlock those opportunities to solve major health problems, to support research into disease and treatments for disease, to support research into climate change and mitigations for climate change. Those are enormous societal benefits, in addition to the economic benefits, in addition to the productivity boosts we're already seeing from AI and we expect to see well into the future. To preserve that ability, we need regulation that is very balanced, so that addresses those risks and harms in ways that boost trust in AI, but that also allow us to, in fact, harness that opportunity of AI. And again, we see Asia as at the forefront of this conversation, in part because Asian publics are so optimistic and encouraged by AI and the positive benefits that are specific to Asia. We released a paper recently about the opportunity that ASEAN countries can unlock. And one of the examples there is rice production. Rice production is really challenged by changes in the climate. And AI can be used to do analysis of different varieties of rice that are more resilient to these changes climatically. So there are just myriad ways that we can use AI to really benefit us. And that's our starting point with policymakers right now, is to say, yes, AI is too important not to regulate, but it's too important not to regulate well. And so that's the way we want to proceed.
Yeah. Krish, I know you spent the vast majority of your career here in the United States, but you recently did several years in India. What is your perspective? I mean, India, I think, is a really interesting test case around so much of this stuff, because there's a long, obviously, sort of market tradition in India, but India also is a place of tremendous political upheaval and has had enormous challenges there. Tell me a little bit about the attitude you think India will bring to this and should bring to this as it begins to think about regulation.
Thanks, Jake. And first of all, it's great to be here. So it's interesting, Jake said there's a lot of political upheaval in India. So when I was in India, everyone thinks there's a lot of political upheaval out here. So that's what they were talking to me about.
And they are not wrong. Let's be clear, they are not wrong.
So in fact, it's kind of interesting. What's happened is that India has always had, as democratic government, it's had these political upheavals and so on. But in the last many years, one of the things that's happened in India, and that's pretty amazing, because I left India when I was 22, when I came here, and I've been in this country for a long time. So India is not the country that I left, right? And one of the big things that's happened in India is that they have realized that they can standardize a lot of things and get a lot of value. So one of the greatest benefits, for example, is UPI, the payment system, which is so much better than anything I've seen, right? And it's standardized things, and they have created a bunch of systems to do that. And it's brought about a lot of value. So in India, they've seen that technology can bring value, and especially the benefits of AI far outweigh, in many cases, some of the problems, right? So one of the examples is multilingual. So I spent the last 4 years working for Flipkart. I was working out the US, but I spent a lot of time in India. And multilingual is a big thing in India. There's 26 languages, of which I can speak only 2 or 3, right? And we used, and these people in tier 2 cities have no way to interact with a commerce platform other than actually type in English or some other version. So this kind of opening up the market to 1.4 billion or something people in India is a huge priority of the government, right? But the government is also developing a way by which they don't want to choke this development. And this is a really important thing for the Indian government. So they have not been as, I would say, prescriptive as I've seen in other places, because they want to really grow the economy. However, one of the things that's in India is that India also has a lot of IT engineers who support a lot of companies here and throughout the world. So they're going to have to learn from that regulation that's coming in EU and the US and so on. And so they're going to absolutely do that. And so India is going to be a little bit of a mishmash in terms of where the regulation will land, but it is coming. It hasn't come. And I'm hoping that it's going to be, hopefully doing it in a way that grows the country.
To me, I mean, so I'll just share an anecdote with the audience from an experience I had interviewing an early AI founder, CEO of a major company. I won't name him here, but we were talking early on about the potential harms of the product that he was helping to make and the ways in which it was facilitating the enormous upsurge in deepfakes, especially political deepfakes. And he basically said, I just think it's best to go forward in making a new technology to assume that the uses of it by and large will be good, and that people are good and they're going to do good things with it, and that it will sort of come out in the wash. And I sort of said to him, well, do you think there's any, do you bear any particular responsibility for any innovative new bad use for the technology you have made? Is it up to you? You've invented the technology. Are you required to invent the rules around it or the ethics that might be applied to it? And he said, well, I mean, think about it this way. If I bake muffins for a living, let's say I bake 10,000 muffins, and one person gets food poisoning, do I need to stop baking muffins? And there was an awkward pause between us, and then I said, yes. In fact, according to the Food and Drug Administration, you're supposed to go figure out exactly what went wrong, what your supply problem is here, and where that tainted quantity came in, and blah, 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 blah. I happened a few weeks later to be at a major industrial bakery that's about an hour from here that produces fresh bread for grocery stores in the region. And the guy showed me at the end of this long tour the metal detector that every single croissant went through. And I said, what are you doing? Why are you putting everything through a metal detector? He said, well, at some point, a bolt is going to come off one of these machines and fall into the dough, and it's going to wind up in one of these things. And if one of my customers bites into that, that's the end of my business. So the standard that guy was holding himself to in terms of a 1 in a billion kind of chance, right? He's talking about a like twice in his career kind of thing, but he will not let that happen because it would be the end of his business. To me, the contrast between those two attitudes was very, very interesting to me. And I think only really in the United States would it be possible for the attitude on the AI CEO's part would he still be in charge of that company and still be running forward? That is, I think, a singularly American thing, and it has empowered the United States to create all sorts of extraordinary things. But I think that's stands in real marked contrast to the regulatory regime we're seeing emerge, certainly in the EU, which is speaking very explicitly about the threat to human dignity and agency, some very abstract, loosey-goosey stuff that here in the United States we might roll our eyes at. And then, of course, there's China, right, which has an extremely strict regulatory regime, down to you need to prove that not only you know exactly how it was built, but that it has, been adequately digesting the teachings of the central party. There's a lot to be talked about there. And I'm throwing this to anybody who wants to talk about it. Should a country thinking about regulation really, obviously they want to emulate the success of the United States in terms of the extraordinary foundational models that have been built here. But should they be emulating the spirit that allows people to say, if I bake muffins and somebody gets poisoned, do I need to stop baking muffins? What is there to learn from the United States other than that you can build an enormous and very successful company in a pretty lax regulatory environment?
I'll jump on that, at least at the beginning of it.
Please do.
So I think what was so important about that anecdote you just told is that you said, well, actually, yes, there are regulations. And I think that's really important because I do think that in the US and elsewhere, you do hear folks talk as if AI had no regulatory framework whatsoever already. And it is true in the US there is no national law for AI, but there's plenty of regulation that AI fits into quite well, and that we are in fact going about a process, I mean as a country, of sort of identifying sector by sector which sector actually is well equipped to handle AI applications and which ones maybe aren't as well equipped. And I think that's in fact a good way to start because it's at that application level where the 1 in a million, the nut lands in the dough happens, right? And it's at that level that we need to think through, what are those contingencies? What are those ways that this could go wrong? And then what are the preventions for that? And then the other thing I'll just note and then open it up to everybody else too is I think the other important thing in the dough maker, the croissant maker, which is my favorite pastry, is, he said, well, my business would be over, right? That's a reputational risk. That is actually not totally separate from, related to, but not the regulation per se, but the market response to it. Nobody's going to want to buy your croissant if you might end up swallowing a bolt. Similarly, we need to build trustworthy AI systems, and companies should be incentivized to do that by the market. Otherwise, people aren't going to want to adopt AI. So I think these are really complementary ideas too.
And before I throw it to the rest of you, can I just ask real quick, do you think that there's anything in the United States in terms of existing regulation that has in any way slowed down the development of artificial intelligence here?
I don't think there's been slowing that you could draw a direct causal line from a regulation to innovation, but I do think, again, there are lots of regulatory frameworks in place that already make American businesses, whether or not you develop AI, think carefully about product development. Yeah, I think I'll just pause there because
Right.
I think I told you earlier when you gave me a heads up about this question that I'd want to think about that really hard because I think that's a very important question to ask.
Right.
But I do think we have, as you've pointed out, a really pro-innovation sort of culture and framework in the United
Right.
States. But I also think we do have an awful lot of regulatory regimes in a lot of different sectors that have really benefited us economically as well. So again, good regulation is what we really want here.
Yeah, I guess I would just to sort of bookend what you're saying. Our regulatory, our innovation, our economic tradition has been highly innovation motivated, and our regulatory tradition has been highly reactive. Right? It took us 30 years to figure out that cigarettes were killing people. It took us. We're still figuring out about gambling. There's all kinds of stuff that we are very reactive around, and yet, as you say, right, once we land on a regulatory regime, it's very strong. Your ability to trust the banking system here is one of the great reasons that the world does its banking in the United States, right? It is absolutely that. But then you also have Elizabeth Warren right now struggling to put some rules around cryptocurrency, just because it's reactive. We've always been pretty reactive around new tech. That's interesting. John, what were you going to say?
So I just wanted to echo everything, of course, and then, but also add, as we have a strong legal system in this country that has, consequences for inaction or fraudulent behavior or knowingly having a weak nuts in your croissant making facility or whatever it might be, that here in the U.S. Our legal systems are strong enough to deal with those consequences. That's why to your point is everything seems to be fitting into our existing structure. We're just trying to figure out how to best fit it into our structure. And we haven't seen a lot of laws needed or new regulations needed, especially, we're talking about IP, we haven't seen that at all. The issue when we flip it back to India is the penalties for failing to comply or for negligence or, intentional, copying someone's intellectual property, whatever it might be, are not strong enough to act as a deterrent, to act to make a manufacturer build this extra metal detector to make sure that they're providing products at the highest quality and everything, because the penalties are not that strong. And even if, what we've seen a lot of times is it's not a deterrent enough to stop the behavior, whatever the penalties may be. So I think that's one area, when we look at India and all of the amazing momentum that it has, especially on AI and many, many other industry sectors, having the adequate deterrents to prevent this fraudulent activity from taking place or to prevent knowingly neglecting your responsibilities, all of that is something that could be strengthened in the system.
Yeah.
I want to draw a line under a point that was made a moment ago about good regulation and how it can actually benefit businesses. So the fact that a door blew off an airplane and the entire airline industry wasn't grounded, that Alaska has not gone out of business, that one of our panelists was on an Alaska airline plane, not long after that happened, and you feel complete confidence because we have not only regulations for this very safety critical, life impacting system, but we also have processes in place for recalls. And there is that reputation. So if that baker gets a bolt in a croissant, or if, God forbid, another accident happened on Alaska Airlines, that's it, game over. So they double down on it. And so how do we create not only the financial incentives that it can't just be the cost of doing business, that when we mess up and someone is hurt, there is a fine, but it's so minimal, it disappears into the calculus of your balance sheet. That's not going to work. Yeah. There also has to be the reputational impact that the rest of society says, yeah, no, not using you again, not giving you my data, not giving you my business until I have confidence that I can trust you with it. And that's one thing that we've learned in enterprise. We've been doing responsible AI going back to 2016 because it just wasn't an option not to. Our customers didn't say, yeah, we'll purchase your AI, and it's icing on the cake if it's accurate. It's fantastic if it doesn't happen to be biased. No, that was table stakes for our customers purchasing our products. And so I think some of the conversations that have been happening around, is, do we have enough regulations in place? Do we need more regulations in place? I think we can look to enterprise businesses where we do have many companies that are building AI in a responsible way, because the companies purchasing it will not purchase it if it's not.
Yeah. The examples that we've cited here that make the United States such a special and safe place when it comes to air travel and food safety and banking, obviously the market incentives are a huge part of that, but a big part of what that flows from is that there is a specific regulatory agency assigned to each of those sectors. The FAA, the Food and Drug Administration, the SEC, right? These are the reasons that these sectors are in part so well patrolled. Do we need that in the United States? And should somebody considering how to set up a regulatory regime around AI in their own country think, oh, I need an FAA for AI, or I need an FAA for tech in general? Does anyone here think that would be a good idea?
Let me take that. So when you think about products, right? Products have tech in them, right? For example, a self-driving car has AI in it, right? But the question is, what do you regulate here? Do you regulate that the car should perform, the product should perform, or are you worried about the AI? So I think it's better for us to look at the product as a whole, first of all. And that's why when we focus on specific sectors, I think we'd be better off regulating that. Like, for example, if you want to let a plane fly itself, right, you can't turn around and just blame the AI. Well, the company that built the plane is responsible for integrating that AI in a responsible manner. So I would first start out there by regulating and making sure we have the regulations in product where AI can do the most harm, right? And if you focus on that, I think you'll have the right level of regulation. And just to follow up on all the great points the other panelists made, is regulation is not enough, right? And the reason the United States has done so well is because we have enforcement. And the enforcement is what allows us to innovate responsibly. The problem in places like India, where I'm from, is that you can get away with a lot of things. The legal system is not strong enough. And because of that, it's actually holding India back. So if you ask me, in a country like India, if you put more regulations on products rather than just on AI, it will be better for India, not worse for India. So I would lean more towards products than going just after what's inside the product. Like, for example, electricity, right, goes inside a product, right? Rather regulate a toaster to make sure it meets whatever specifications.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say, to take that one step further, I think a lot of the emphasis on models themselves and like does this regulation apply? Well, only for models that exceed a certain number of flops. Yeah, I think that's
which is something like sort of how the EU is thinking about this in a way.
Exactly.
If it's big enough and influential enough, then we'll regulate it in a certain way.
Absolutely, and I think you're losing the forest for the trees at that point. We need to think about the AI systems. It's not just about the model itself and the millions of things, the universe of possibilities that can be done with this model, but like, what actually are you doing with this model? What is the system? You can do a lot of harm with a simple if this, then that statement. We have a lot of government in the US that still run on Excel macros. How many of you in this room are still writing Excel macros? they power a lot of things, and you can make a lot of outright biased, harmful decisions with simple logic. You don't need an AI model that exceeds GPT-5 in order to do that. So being able to take the context, understanding how is this being used? It's very different from when we're talking about generating proteins for drug discovery than it is in an airplane, than it is in, you know, recommending the next movie that you're gonna binge watch on Netflix. And so understanding the context and being focused on the applications is extremely important to Alice's point, having good, meaningful regulation.
Yeah, the way we talk about it at Google is we call it the hub and spoke approach. So there have been, you know, various proposals around the world for sort of departments of AI, but we think because sectoral expertise is so essential to understanding where the issues are that need regulation for protection of the proper use of whatever the tool is that AI is integrated into products, as Krish pointed out, you really want those sectoral regulators to stay in the lead. That said, you do need AI expertise. Yes. So the U.S. is one of the things in the EO is, you know, every agency has to now stand up AI expertise, right? But it also empowered a hub or NIST to really develop a lot of deeper technical expertise to give agencies advice on how to do that regulation, right? So you really need to marry that sort of core set of folks in government that really get AI and are keeping up with the technology, which is advancing so rapidly, that work hand in hand with those sectoral regulators who at the end of the day will be the ones that know what good regulation looks like in their domains.
Mm-hmm. So here in the United States, we obviously, you know, because we are so pro-market and we have been so much, especially around tech regulation, in a regime in which each state makes sort of its own rules and that's how it goes. I find myself drawing this parallel to the auto industry in the ways in which here in California, our emission standards wound up, for market reasons, becoming the de facto emission standards for the industry because no car maker wanted to make a separate vehicle model for California as opposed to other places. There's some cases in which that's a little squishy, but for the most part, that's borne out. And I wonder if now that we're seeing the EU spin up the most stringent regulations, certainly in the Western world, are we at a place where the EU is going to wind up being the de facto California of AI regulation, and it will be, you know, if an Asian economy is considering what model to follow, they might as well follow the EU model because that's going to wind up being what everybody makes their products for anyway. Is the EU's regulation enough to prompt a one-size-fits-all response from, at this point, typically mostly American companies?
I don't think so. And here's why I think the analogy breaks down, is because the reason that California has mandated the emission standards is very clear. If you don't have good emission standards, you're going to breathe bad air. So it's very, very clear that there's a huge benefit to that. And I think that, and California is a big enough block that was able to drive that innovation, right, for the rest of the world. Now, if people really feel, everybody feels that AI regulation is so important that it's really damaging our lives in the same way that bad emissions are, then that's likely to happen. But I don't see that happening, at least in the near future.
Yeah, I think the same thing, especially in India. They look at the U.S. system and the European system as totally opposed, diametrically opposed to each other, and they're looking to do something in the middle, is what I get the sense. So I don't think they'll follow Europe as a standard. I think they find it too restrictive, is my sense. So they could surprise me, but I think that's where they're going to wind up. They've been, like I said, they're very carefully moving forward, which I think is good. They, on AI, and I'll share this because it's just some recent news, like on AI. AI with respect to protecting intellectual property, there was a recommendation just maybe 18 months ago from the parliament to have the Indian government create an entirely separate AI body for securing intellectual property rights related to IP. And that was something that caused us a lot of concern. As we're seeing now, we see AI fits into our existing structure quite well. We're just, navigating the if, thens, and buts. But when it comes to India, just like 2-3 days ago, they've made a very similar statement that the existing IP system is sufficient to cover innovations on AI. And I think that's a big step forward, because there was a lot of concerns about creating yet another question about how this would be employed, how it would overlap with existing rights and things like that. So not necessarily a regulatory body, but where we're granting rights that could impact other rights and other systems around the world. So we're pleased to see that. Hopefully it stays that way.
Sam Altman at OpenAI, at one point when the EU regulations were unveiled, did say, the company said that there was some potential that they would not release ChatGPT in the EU because of that. And I guess, Alice, my question for you is, do you think that companies that make foundational models, can they meet the market, whatever the regulatory regime is going to be, or is there the possibility that making a certain regulatory decision will in fact mean that as a market, Google can't affordably meet them there?
I honestly think it's too soon to tell, which sounds wild in the EU context, I realize. But there's still actually quite a lot of work to do as they stand up their AI office. They figure out what their reporting requirements are going to be. They still have their risk-based framework, and they've identified sort of use cases, but part of the AI office's work is going to be identifying particular applications, right? So I actually think there's sort of a lot more to be revealed in how it's really going to work in the EU, and that's going to help businesses understand, how burdensome or doable this really is. I think the thing we can say about the EU process is it was very, very thorough, and they really did consult a wide range of stakeholders, and it looks to all intents and purposes like that will continue. So I do think, we can't tell yet. That said, I think that's something that's a serious consideration for any government, is to think through, is our environment friendly to business, friendly to economic growth, or not? And to think through that calibration. Again, regulation can be very, very positive for business because it can give us a lot of predictability and so forth, but we have to get the regulation right.
So I'm going to open this up to audience questions here, so get your questions ready here, and I'll, in the meantime, just ask one final one of our panelists, which is that we've talked, about regulation, and we've certainly talked about the potential benefits of AI. You spoke earlier, Alice, about the tremendous biomedical potential of AI, the agricultural, the climate change effects, all of that. When we think about regulating in advance of harms that AI could cause, do you think that we know enough about the effects of AI to even know what the possible harms are, right? OpenAI just released its new Sora model, this video generation model, and if you have not played around with that, whoa, it is lifelike video of whatever you can think of, right? And who knows how that's going to be, right, intentionally misused, we can certainly imagine, but all the secondary effects that are going to happen across, we just finished a writers and screen actors strike. The technical Hollywood people are all about to go on, they're all negotiating their new contract right now. God knows what they're up all night thinking about in the face of that. So I guess I'm just wondering, Kathy, maybe I'll throw this to you because I know you think about this so much, but when you worry about negative effects, what do you worry about? And what should somebody thinking about a regulatory regime for their own nation, what for you is top of mind when you think about real harms that you think could come out of it?
I worry about the liar's dividend. It's a situation where you can no longer trust what you see, to the point that liars benefit from the doubt that we all have absorbed in what we see. We can't trust what we hear. Courts can't trust that the videos or the photos that are submitted as evidence are actually evidence, that everything ends up being thrown out as a result of it. Extremely concerned about elections. There are 60 elections that will have happened globally by the end of the year. And it's becoming so cheap to create deep fakes. And although with the recent Biden robocall that happened a few weeks ago, although the FTC has said this is against the law, and they did manage to find who was responsible for it, we can't guarantee that will always be the case. And we have to make sure that not only can we A, detect when that does happen, but B, the penalties have got to be so severe that the calculus just doesn't work out for you, that the cost of being caught completely outweighs any benefit you might get from your intentional misinformation and disinformation. So how do we do that? Watermarking, crypto marks, things like that on content is extremely difficult to implement and extremely easy to remove when bad actors want to remove it. And so how do we put the regulations in place that when it does happen, when you are caught, that there is absolutely no question that the hammer comes down with finality?
Before we take questions from the audience, anyone else have a top concern? I mean, I think that this idea. Yeah, please, Krish, go ahead.
I think that AI can have unintended side effects. As an example, the Indian government, right, has made a statement that it will not allow self-driving in India. Okay, and the reason is, unlike most of us here, we drive our own cars. If you go to India, most people have a driver. Okay, one is it's very difficult to drive in India, and plus there's an economic disparity by which a lot of these people, this is how they earn their living. So this is an unintended consequence. If you think about even in this country, right, let's imagine we have self-driving cars and there are no more Uber drivers, right? My son worked in the summer earning a little bit of money through Uber, and there are many others who actually that's their full-time living, right? So there are these consequences, and I don't think we should be unmindful of this, even though it may not affect you and me and the people in this room. This is, I think, super important to think about, because we need to ask ourselves, what is the reason for this innovation, right? If this innovation causes major disruptions in society, I don't think it's a good thing.
Now, let's talk. Who has a question here? We have a couple of folks going around with mics, and they'll bring you one. This gentleman here in the vest, I believe, is first.
So when one thinks of industries that could do a lot of harm with AI, one quickly comes to national defense and like activities. Is there any reason to believe that national defense activities, such as, say, the U.S. Department of Defense or the PLA, would pay any attention whatsoever to some regulation passed by the European Union?
I do not know the answer to that question. I am very interested to hear the answer to that. Does anybody have a thought about that?
Don't look at me.
I mean, in the United States, we do have some tradition of trying to align military policy with the laws that govern private citizens up to a point. Of course, right? Murder in a military context and murder in a civilian context are very, very different. But the weird thing about my job is that I go to these places where I hear, like the military in the United States has a very long tradition of investigating secondary, tertiary effects. There's a whole discipline devoted to that. And the degree to which they would or wouldn't care about EU regulations, I guess, is one thing, but this brings me back to this question of whether or not the pipeline will somehow be affected by a company like Google or anyone else who makes a foundational model feeling they need to shift it in order to make the minimum viable product that can work in any regulatory environment. I feel like that, for some reason, is going to affect this more than individualized military decisions. I don't know. I feel like I'm riffing on this one, but I'm not sure that I know the answer to that one.
I mean, I'll just say that we go through great lengths on the cybersecurity side, within the U.S. government to track down material weaknesses in IT systems. And I think that AI is going to play a role in that effort, and both in helping to track down, like who wrote malware, whatever it might be, or even having to track down the AI that did that as well.
Yeah.
I think those are going to be challenges for our government to face, but not from a defense perspective. I don't know enough to say.
Who else? Up front here, ma'am, and then, sir, you'll be next, and then I see you as well. Thank you. Sorry. Well, he's going to go first because he's closest. That's okay. Go ahead, sir. If you wouldn't mind, I forgot to ask everyone to do this. If you don't mind identifying yourself, you don't have to, but if you wouldn't mind, that'd be great.
Okay, my name is Ray Chang. I'm a partner with one of the consulting accounting firm. My question to the panel is this. When we talk about regulations, are we talking about regulations regulating the technology itself, or are we talking about regulating the use of the technology? Because if we're talking about regulating the technology itself, that artificial intelligence today, maybe quantum computing tomorrow, we can hardly keep up with the evolution of technology. And my second question to that is, if we're talking about the regulation of the use of technology, then I have clients doing remote surgery, using robotic arms to do remote heart surgery. So if we use a Gen AI or any AI algorithm in that equipment, that could have a life and death situation, versus another company that, say Netflix, that they help you to rate the effectiveness of the movies. That's a little different harm to do it. So that's why I'm kind of driven my question about are we talking about the usage of technology, or really regulating the technology itself?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking exactly the right question, sir. Because regulating underlying technology is a challenging thing to do, particularly in the AI space, because the underlying technology is still in an early stage of development and is changing so much that I think in a pragmatic sense, it's a challenge for governments to regulate at the model level, because how we think of models and what the architecture of models, everything is sort of still in development, right? The innovation is still happening quite quickly. Whereas again, if you think about sort of where people will actually interact with the technology, it's at that application level, which happens in sectoral context, which happens in products. So you've seen sort of a combination of approaches over the last few years, and particularly over the last year. And there's a lot of interest in sort of the biggest models because they're the cutting edge of the technology, and because they're where we're discovering a lot of sort of the outer edge of capabilities of AI, right? But I think it is quite prudent to think about technology itself as something that is neutral, and it is the uses that we really want to focus on and spend our regulatory energy there, because again, that's where most people are going to interact with it. And that also allows us to incentivize businesses towards responsible uses, towards responsible AI, but also continue to incentivize innovation itself.
Maybe one way to think about the contrast in which different geopolitical players are thinking about this, right? In the United States, I met a fledgling law firm, 3 partners who are essentially now going around to big Fortune 500 companies and saying, here are the places in which you, specifically you, company X, can get into huge amounts of trouble for having put some big decision in the arms of AI. And they said, 2 or 3 years ago, they were getting laughed out of the office. They couldn't get anything. Today, they are overwhelmed by the amount of work that they have, because suddenly there's this realization that there are protected classes you can't be messing around with, and there's all sorts of problems you can get into if you do sort of overdo it. That, to me, feels like a sort of very specific kind of American legal liability kind of regime, regulatory regime. China, right, is making it now, their rule is that if there is a misuse of AI, it falls on the company that made it they're the ones who get in trouble. So that there's I think a very diverse set of regulatory responses to the question that you're describing. In the front row here, she had her hand up earlier. If I could throw a mic at, sorry, just up in the front row here. Oh, there we go. Great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ria. I'm at Stanford doing political science and computer science, and I've been working on AI policy in the last year. I was wondering, for the industry policy teams, have you noticed that in meetings with regulators and policymakers that there's kind of a united front among the industry teams, or have you observed that there are kind of different positions that people are holding? I think particularly maybe if there are any differences between companies that are more focused in the foundation model area versus, as you've talked about, companies that are closer to the use cases.
I just talked.
So there's a industry organization, BSA, that tends to represent quite a few different companies, and so they'll often write letters on behalf of their members when new regulations are proposed or there's calls for feedback, and they'll send it around to the companies, and then companies can either agree, yes, this represents our point of view, and sign on to it, or say, we're gonna submit our own stance. I think there's a lot of similarity amongst enterprise customers because how we build AI can be different or how we are incentivized. So for example, Salesforce, we are a CRM, we're a productivity company. It's not in our best interest to gamify our products and have people spend more time in it. You want to go in, get your job done. When we create our models, we give it to our customers. It goes into their orgs behind a firewall. We can't see their data. We can't see their models. So it's just a very different way of how we are doing AI than consumer-facing customers, and so, or companies. And so I think you'll see some differences there in how companies give feedback based on different regulations, policies, standards, or frameworks.
So we have time for one final question. Did you have your hand up, Em? Yeah, she'll be our final question. And then, of course, we're going to have this networking event afterwards, and you'll have a chance to hopefully speak with the panelists individually. Go ahead.
Sure, Nidhi Sharma, fairly straightforward question. So, rewinding a couple of months ago, the whole sort of like OpenAI, Sam Altman firing that happened, it was kind of like quite a drama. So I'm just curious to hear from your perspective, like what is the role that organizational structure and governance structure within the company? Like what is the role and how do you set up something that's effective to create responsible AI or responsible solutions? So.
I mean, here at Google, I mentioned much earlier that we have these foundational AI principles, and we were one of the first companies to come out with such a set of principles in 2018. And that's really, in a very practical way, our guidelines internally. And in fact, we have processes internally for every product we introduce. If it's got AI in it, if it's got generative AI in it, we have to check it against the principles. We also have to check it for risks that are implied by the principles, and then map those risks to risk mitigation, right? So we have a process internally to hold ourselves accountable to our own principles. I think that kind of internal governance structure, if that's what you're asking about, is a very healthy kind of thing to have. We're not alone in that kind of approach, but that is, I think, a really important structure cross-functionally where folks across the company have to think this through. So partners both in product and trust and safety, our own team, we're all thinking carefully from all angles before we put something into the world.
Yeah, I would say similarly that we have additionally a set of trusted AI principles. Last year, we published a set of guidelines for responsible generative AI, but we very much believe it takes a village. Every single employee is responsible for ethics, just as they are for security. all of us, regardless of what organization you work for, there's an expectation that you're not going to be clicking on dodgy links. 1234 is not your password. Like there are just certain rules that even though you're not part of security, there's an expectation that you are responsible for security at your company. Similarly for ethics. And so in our new hire orientation, just as there is a module for security for all new hires, we have one for ethics as well. And so understanding, so everybody understands what the policies are, they know when to come to us, they know what our acceptable use policy is, what are our red lines for what are we going to build, what are we not going to build, what do we allow our customers to do or not do. And it all comes down to leadership. And so you have to have strong leadership, you have to have strong incentive structures to make the hard choices and decide, yes, we said this is a red line, this is still a red line, this is not where we're going to go, even if there might be a lot of money or a lot of other desires to do something in specific.
I'd like to chime in on that. ServiceNow is a company, it's an enterprise software company, and the burden is very high in terms of respecting customer data, right? We treat it extremely seriously, which means that the whole company thinks like that. So we have very extensive processes to make sure that we do not misuse customer data in any way, shape, or form, which is very different. When you work for a non-enterprise software company, the rules are not quite potentially as stringent as when you're working for an enterprise software company. It should be, but I think it's very important. The culture of the company is very important, and it's not just one person saying it. It has to be kind of drilled down into every individual.
And not in any way to contradict our panelists, but I will say Sam Altman establishing this as OpenAI as a not-for-profit inside a sort of for-profit shell. I think that's the last time we're going to see that for a while, right? He has more or less openly said that was a naive mistake, and now they've drifted to this model that is much more like the typical Silicon Valley company. So that kind of governance, if anyone here has seen a different form of governance emerging in one of the top players, I'd be very interested to hear about it, but it all seems to be drifting one way. Yeah, I don't know Anthropic well enough to understand their system. They are, I believe they are also a for-profit vehicle, right? They're not a capped for-profit idea, but nobody has established themselves as a philanthropic research organization, and just the expense alone of establishing a foundational model, I think, restricts it to a very handful of pretty well-established business models. That's what I've observed. So this has been so interesting. I could go on with these guys for hours, but we can't. So please thank the panelists with me, and let's gather together for drinks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jake, for tying that together so beautifully, from the liar's dividend to a once-in-a-generation opportunity. There's a lot to think about, but I feel good and confident that all of you are working on this and will resolve it for us. So thank you very much for all the work that you do. A big thank you to Google, to James Green and Nicole Azores. It is a beautiful, beautiful venue. Thank you very much. And for our audience, if you're not already an Asia Society member in Northern California or Seattle, please consider joining us. A QR code is going to be put up on the screen. We have programs in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, in Seattle, and virtually, a few of them upcoming. A roundtable on disinformation in ASEAN countries, that's virtual on February 27th. A Lunar New Year roundtable with Chef Kathy Fang in San Francisco on February 29th. The latest on Taiwan and the recent election on March 15th. Gender equality in Korea, that's on March 28th. We have a big Game Changer West Gala, that's on April 4th in San Francisco. We're going to be spotlighting remarkable Asians and Asian Americans who are changing the world for the better, so please do join us. I'd like to give a shout out to our team. Most of them are over there. Christy Young-Smith, Nina, Jason, Aaron, and all of our interns. Thank you for all of your hard work on this program. Deeply grateful again to all of our speakers. We have food and drink. There's some fancy pineapple spa water from Google over there. Please enjoy it. We're here till 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.